and welcome to Money, Money, Money. I'm Samira Abdi. There's something about the words tax-free that bring a smile to everyone's face. And when tax-free returns are maximized, well, you can only imagine the kind of impact or the reactions that one would get. And it is for this reason that the team at Money, Money, Money has decided to explain how to get the highest post-tax returns when investing in mutual funds. Hemant Rustagi of WISEINVEST Advisors is our expert this week. Hemant, thanks very much for joining in. So tell me first, what is the kind of impact that an investor sees if they don't judge an instrument by its post-tax returns?
Well, I think it can make a huge difference, especially when you're investing for long-term, medium-term, and in fact, even I would say when you're investing for the short-term. I mean, for example, when you invest for the short-term, okay, you generally look at safety of capital. So you would invest in an instrument where your capital is safe, which means your returns are going to be low. And if you're going to pay tax on that, then obviously a post-tax return is going to be even lower, and there's no way you can, beat inflation even in the long term, because when you have long-term goals like children education or retirement planning, you don't know how much is enough. So it's very, very important then to look at instruments where they are, which are tax efficient. Now let's look at an example. In India, for example, a lot of people put money in the bank deposits. Nothing wrong with it, because they feel that the money that they invest in the bank deposit is safe. But what they ignore is the post-tax return. The fact is that every single penny that you get as an interest from the bank is taxed. So for example, if you're in the highest tax bracket of 30% and you're getting an interest rate of 8%, you end up paying more than 2.5, so 2.4. So what you're left with is only 5.6, which is less than inflation, which means that over the years, even though your money will be growing in numbers but not in value, you will realize later on that there is a huge gap in what you require to meet your goals and what you're going to actually accumulate. So I think it's very, very important. And I think one of the reasons why you see still a lot of investors investing in small saving schemes, bank deposit, because they focus only on the gross return and not on the post-tax return. I think it's very, very important for every investor to focus on post-tax, because at the end of the day, that decides how much you're going to keep with you over a period of time, not the gross return. Yeah,
that's true. But tell me one thing, how can one judge where post-tax returns would be highest, or should it be a mix of, say, equity funds, balanced funds, ELSS, debt funds, income funds? They all have different treatments, right? So how does one judge?
See, first thing I think it's important for investors to realize that mutual fund as an investment vehicle is more tax efficient than traditional options. We did discuss about bank deposit, we look at small saving schemes, you look at bonds, debentures, everywhere you need to pay tax. When it comes to mutual fund, okay, the mutual funds are more tax efficient investment vehicle. The way it has been described, as per the tax rule, there are two types of funds in mutual funds offered by them. One is equity fund. Now these are the fund where a fund has exposure of 65% or more in equity. The others are all categorized as debt fund. So when you invest in the so-called equity funds, any capital gain that you make, okay, within let's say 1 year is treated as short-term capital gain and is taxed at flat rate of 15%. Any gain that you make on redemption of units after 1 year is all tax-free. Any dividend that you get from these funds is all tax-free. So there is no tax that you have to pay, and there is no dividend distribution tax that the fund has to pay. Now let's talk about the other category of fund, which is debt-oriented. So there, the long-term capital gain becomes applicable only after 3 years. So any gain that you make within 3 years, for example, if you redeem your units within 3 years, you need to pay tax at your applicable tax rate. So if you belong to, again, 30% tax bracket, you have to pay 30% tax. Any gain that you make after 3 years is treated as long-term capital gain. You can claim indexation and you have to pay tax at the rate of 20%. So there is, like I said, the mutual fund as a vehicle is more tax efficient. Within that, again, it's very, very important for you to select the right fund, because if you want to maximize these gains, you have to be very careful in terms of how you do that. The second important thing is, you need to have a plan in place. Many a times, why investors end up paying more tax? Because they have haphazard strategies. We spend so much time while investing our money. When it comes to selling funds, we don't have a strategy in mind. Whenever the market tanks, whenever the market goes down, whenever the markets are volatile, we exit. We exit from equity, go into debt. When the markets are rising, we take out money from debt and go into equity. The result of that is many a times we end up paying short-term capital gain. So one, I think if you plan your investment well, you define your goals, have a defined time horizon, that allows you to stay committed to your time horizon, that allows you to invest for long term. So automatically, your gains become long-term gain and your returns become much higher than what you get if you don't invest properly.
Okay, fair enough. Now, within this, you've chosen to go ahead and invest. What's the impact if you were to choose a growth plan or a dividend plan or a reinvestment plan? How would each of these matter?
Well, I think they can make a significant difference there. Now, for example, we just mentioned about what are the tax benefits of investing in different kind of funds. So let's look at someone who is investing in a debt fund. Let's say short-term parking of fund. So if you're investing in, let's say, ultra short-term fund or a short-term fund for around 1 year or 2 years, because up to 3 years is a short-term capital gain. Now, the short-term capital gain for someone who is in tax bracket of 10 to 20% will be applicable at that rate. Now, let's look at someone who is paying tax at the rate of 10%.
Sure.
Now, he should be then looking at a growth option, because even if there is a short-term capital gain, he would end up paying only 10% tax. But if he has to opt then dividend distribution, for example, okay, there are different funds. You have daily dividend reinvestment, you have monthly payout, you have quarterly payout, half-yearly payout. All these debt funds have to pay a dividend distribution tax at the rate of around 28% or thereabout. Now imagine if you opt for a dividend option, your fund will pay 28% tax and you will get the rest of it. Here, because you opted for growth option, even if you redeem your units, you can decide when you want dividend, you can decide when you want this money, you pay only 10% tax. Similarly, even for someone in the tax bracket of 20%, it makes sense to go for growth. But someone who's in 30% tax bracket, and he is going to redeem his units within, let's say, 3 years, it still makes sense for him to go for dividend distribution, because he'll end up paying around 28%. Here he will pay 30% plus surcharge. So I think it's very, very important to look at your time horizon, look at your own tax rate, and then decide. Similarly, if you look at equity funds, if someone who wants regular income from equity funds, right, immediately, let's say within the next 6 months or less, 1 year, then rather than going for growth, you go for dividend payout, because it helps you in two ways. One is that you get tax-free dividend. You don't have to time your redemptions. The fund manager, whenever he feels that he has distributable surplus, he will give you that. So you avoid market timing. You actually get tax-free dividends. So clearly, it can make a huge difference. So I think investors need to be very, very careful when they decide which option to go for.
Okay, what about someone who needs a regular income, right? So MIP is not tax efficient at all. What are the options for a person like that?
Well, fortunately, Sumera, today, mutual fund industry has certain products where you can get maybe, as much as what you're getting from MIP in terms of gross return, but the returns can be much more tax efficient. You have this new breed of funds called equity saving fund and also the balance advantage fund. So let's focus on equity saving fund, for example. Now, these are the funds which typically invest in a mix of equity. They have a restricted exposure to equity, maybe around 15-20%. Then they invest around 40-45% in arbitrage, and the rest goes into debt. The way it works is the arbitrage is treated as equity from the taxation point of view. So if you add up arbitrage and equity, if it is more than 65%, the fund
treated as an equity
yes,
fund.
exactly. The fund is not required to pay any dividend distribution tax. Okay. The second is they are more consistent than MIPs, because in MIP, if the portfolio consists of equity as well as debt and long-term debt, there can be a lot more volatility compared to this, because arbitrage is quite safe in that sense. It brings a lot of stability. Even the debt portion in these funds is actually managed as a short-term debt fund. So your returns are going to be higher, your post-tax return is going to be much higher. Then if you can take some risk, you can go into balance advantage fund. It has the same combination. Maybe the equity exposure is more. In fact, today, there are a number of balance fund which invest as high as 65% or maybe even more at times, also giving dividend on a regular basis. So clearly, you can look at a mix. You don't have to put all your money into balance or equity saving. You can actually have a mix of these three, and then make sure that overall exposure to equity is not more than 30-35%. Because if you do a mix of these in right proportion, you still get tax efficient return, which is much better than what you're getting in MIP.
Yeah, I wonder how many people have actually thought of that. But finally, what about a pure arbitrage fund itself? I mean, if a limited exposure to arbitrage can be good, would someone benefit, especially in the highest tax bracket, by investing entirely in arbitrage funds?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. We did mention about ultra short-term fund or short-term fund, especially where the intent is to park money for a few months or maybe 6 months or less than 1 year. You have these arbitrage funds. Again, what are these arbitrage funds doing? They're basically trying to generate return from you from the arbitrage opportunity that exists between cash market and the future market. They never take exposure to the cash market as such. So, they're quite safe. For tax purposes, as of now at least, they're treated as equity funds.
Yeah, that makes sense. And my final question actually hinges on this, because a lot of people, when they're doing an SIP, would start, say, at the beginning of the year or whenever, and go on for the next 10 months, 12 months, whatever. Now it'll become tax-free only at the end of 1 year. What they don't realize is that even the last EMI has to actually complete 1 year before that portion becomes tax-free, right? So would you then advise that if your goal is, say, 5 years or 6 years, whatever, you stop your EMI 1 year before your goal is due?
Well, I think that's a great question. Most investors make this mistake. Okay, so I think they need to look at it differently. Now, for example, someone who has a time horizon of 5 years, they should break it into two parts. One is maybe they stop investing in equity funds or balanced fund
in the fourth year,
in the third or fourth year, and for the rest of the money should go into like arbitrage funds and all that, so that returns become more tax efficient. The volatility risk is taken care of. You don't have the fear of, or the risk of losing a part of your capital, especially the installment that you paid in the last 1 year.
Yeah, and most importantly, when you complete your goal, you don't get a shock when you suddenly realize, what has happened. All right, on that note, it's time for us to take a very quick break. When we return, we'll answer some of the queries that have been sent in by our viewers. Hemant is going to stay on with us, so do stay tuned. We'll be back in just a bit.